Hello and welcome to Burrill Green. We're a worldwide management consultancy group specialising in corporate security. The first job, of course, is to protect assets. That's people and ideas. Having got that right, what we try and do is help organisations and enterprises to do something else. We call it adding value. We try and help companies get added value from best practice corporate security. And added value could mean improved productivity, increased profitability. It could mean better governance, enhanced corporate reputation and general goodwill. And that takes two things. First of all, it takes a consummate set of best practice craft skills, and also it takes great people. Since we've been running our enterprise, we've learnt an awful lot about combining those two things. In fact, all our own people are people who have had successful careers at senior levels in corporate security environments. That makes us unique from many, if not all, of our competitors, because we actually have done things in practice rather than just in theory. One of the reasons we started this business came out of discussions between myself, who spent significant years in commercial environments, and David Burrill, our co-founder and chairman, who combines military and security careers together with private enterprise, an all-round view. David, way back in the 80s, was the first person to create a resettlement service for the British Army's intelligence corps. This has become a global benchmark, a best practice example for people to follow. And we've applied this sort of experience in our dealings with organisations every day. In fact, we've created a virtuous circle of services to support the Burrill Green Group. And these services include companies like Secure Leadership. Secure Leadership is dedicated to identifying and placing excellent candidates for senior corporate security and risk management roles. Analysts for Security is another division which focuses on analytics, a specialist separate set of skills, but operating under the same principles that Burrill Green applies to everything, which is called adding value to security. And to cap it all, we also have just launched a learning facility, a learning centre, where we can coach and mentor people throughout their careers, called the Burrill Green Corporate Security Business School. So what we're doing in this virtuous circle is bringing all that we know, all our experiences, pragmatic experiences, learned lessons and so on, so that we can share them with you. One of the critical things people face is moving from one form of life in one form of career area to another. We've spent a lot of time advising people informally on how to make moves, and we've decided to formalise this practice. We've just created a book called Crossing the Line, which is all about how you move from public sector to private sector jobs and vice versa, but particularly the former. And this is designed to give a lot more detail about what you're going to hear in the rest of this interview. And this interview today is going to cover aspects of critical elements of making a successful crossing the line. That includes things like preparing a CV, looking for jobs in the right area, and getting a better understanding of business ethics, of business culture, of the languages people use that are different from the ones you've been used to. Moving can be like moving from one country to another. Remember being a child and moving somewhere and being amazed at how different a country was with its language and styles and things you weren't familiar with. Moving to a private enterprise from public sector can be exactly the same, if not more daunting in many cases. Our mission today is to try and help you cross those lines successfully. So we're going to set this up as an interview and see how it goes. David, is age a barrier to a second career?
No, I don't think it is. If we go back about 20 years ago, I think age mattered far more, particularly in the context of somewhere like the United Kingdom. Less so in the United States, where there's been ageism laws for a significant period of time. I think if you go back 20 years ago, which was when I came out of the public sector, then there was a general feeling that you needed to leave and get out before you were 50, because your potential employers would think actually they got too short a time if you came out after 50. With the change as regards pensions, etc., I think that actually now people say we're going to get a good span out of them. So if you're coming out at 50, 55, I think there's still plenty of scope for people to get a good career, and I think it's far less of a hurdle than it was before. Will there be some people who think actually he's a bit old? There may well be. But as a broad guide, I think it's not as worrying as historically it was, as a factor to consider when you're thinking about crossing the line from the public sector.
Okay, right. Critical issue here. Should people be prepared to move house or country to get the next job?
Certainly, if they have that degree of flexibility to say, I'm prepared to move anywhere, or just add another element to it, I'm prepared to travel extensively, I think that makes them potentially a better asset to certain companies in certain areas. Does it rule them out completely if they're not prepared to do that? No, it doesn't. But certainly it opens their horizons if they're prepared to put that over, because increasingly in modern society it is more difficult to get people who are prepared to commit to move and be based overseas or do travel, certainly excessive travel. So there's an issue there. It's not a showstopper, but no question about it, if you get yourself in that pool that you can do whatever the company wants you to do, then you've added a little bit of a bonus to what they're looking for.
Now, some people would say within that what I'm going to say is an obvious thing, but people's personalities are different, of course. And what I'm going to say is a number of people might say they're just going to get the job and announce it to their family and children and so on. What's your view on sharing this change or development within the family?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely crucial when particularly after a substantial career in the public sector, in whatever environment, that you involve your family in every aspect of your considerations into starting a new career. They have been used to a particular context, and they're probably comfortable with that context. And at the time that the individual is thinking of changing from public to private sector, that for the family is often a change of dramatic scale. Involve them, get their participation, understand their fears, as well as their understanding of the opportunities there, and then I think the individual will be in a much better way to go for the next career, and also to ensure that he's done right by his family.
Obviously, a lot of people that we work with and a lot of people whose experience we come to depend on have had successful first careers in military and law enforcement environments. How relevant are military skills today when moving into private sector or commercial environments?
Yeah. If I take those being, let's say, first of all, military skills and law enforcement skills, they are relevant. They've had a degree of training in those specific spheres which embrace security, which is probably greater than they would get in any part of the private sector. That's the first point. I think the next thing is, though, they've also, of course, had broad experience, general management experience, leadership experience, and all of these skills, both the specific with regard to security and risk, and the broader ones are transferable. One of the points on transferring them, though, is, of course, they may be known by different terms.
Exactly. So there's a question of translation, not just transferability, isn't there?
Yeah, and the translation thing, I think, is really important. And one of the fundamentals when someone is making this move and preparation, they need to make sure they understand business language. They need to spend quite a lot of time beforehand. And to be honest, if we're talking about a year, 2 years of taking the trouble to read business journals, reading the Financial Times regularly, to understand the terminology that is there, in addition to the other bonus of understanding what's actually happening in world business, but the terminology and being able to understand how that terminology aligns with the terminology they've been using. And if they then are going to an interview, of course, it's far better if they're understanding all the terminology that's thrown at them, instead of having to constantly say, well, how does that fit in with what I know? It's preparation.
Of course, we still find in Burrill Green that a number of people in place, chief security officers and so on, come up to us and say, I can't get a meeting with the board of management or the C-suite. And it's a frustration for them. And we tend to regard that as symptomatic of a deeper problem, which basically comes down to not using the right language, exactly your point.
Yeah, yes, there's a lack of preparation there, no question of that, in the context of which we've just been describing. And if that lack of preparation stays with them and they're not changing, then they are going to find it far, far more difficult to influence those who are going to actually, in effect, enable them or prevent them from achieving what they want to achieve in the corporate sector. So yes, it's one of the foundations that has to be there. If it isn't there, it's going to harm them thereafter.
Yeah. And of course, another part of that is today's truly embedded and integrated CSO or risk manager is going to have to be able to demonstrate that security is not simply a cost of doing business, but that it is adding value to the enterprise in general.
Yeah, absolutely right again. And this is about learning about how security can add value and not taking the old-fashioned stance, which people used to refer to as the corporate cop stance, where really the newly appointed security officer, if he'd come from a public sector background, let us say law enforcement or military, would be often in the past just happy to top up his pension, right? He didn't really want to become a businessman. And in not wanting to become a businessman, he hadn't done the research into business more broadly and to actually how security could really add value in the context, I think, that you brought up in your introductory talk to this interview. And if they're in that position, they'll never see the opportunities. If they don't see the opportunities, then the company's not going to be benefiting from it.
Well, it also creates a flaw in the security because it's actually not integrated.
Yeah,
and
absolutely right. And they need to, I think you often use the phrase, get it. Before they go for their job in the private sector, they need to have done the work beforehand that ensures that they get that aspect.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not saying that if they don't get it, they may not get into a job where they have a satisfactory career. There are still plenty of companies out there that, again, use that phrase, have not got it, so they don't get it in regards to how security can add greater value to their companies. If the old corporate cop gets into that environment, he'll survive for a while. But that environment is reducing dramatically with time, and more companies are expecting much, much more out of their head of security and their other senior security managers.
Well, an example of that would be someone like General Electric, which applied Six Sigma thinking to all its divisions, including corporate security, and the CSO there has Six Sigmatized security successfully.
And that's absolutely right. And what he'd driven through the corporate security function was the process that was being driven through all the other functions. So corporate security was not an exception. It was seen as something which was totally aligned. Absolutely right.
Oh, okay. When should someone start preparing for retirement or a second career realistically?
Yeah, it needs to be well out. 3 years would not be too soon. Would not be too soon. Now, I meet many people who prepare in the months before they're coming out. They're always at a disadvantage. The sooner they can start thinking about it and have the time to take the necessary preparations, some of which we've talked about, the better, quite frankly. They don't want to be in a sense of panic by doing it well out, as I say, 3 years, 2 years. The chances of them being panicked is much, much less. The chances of them taking all the measures that will help them, much greater.
Okay. Although, of course, there are quite a number of people who find themselves unexpectedly out of a role through redundancies or things where they didn't have quite so much notice.
That's true. But in fairness to the public sector, here is one aspect where I would say that they're probably given more time than their counterparts in the private sector. So usually in the public sector, there is a very good process, if they're going to be made redundant, to give them time, give them training, give them assistance to be able to make this transition. But I do agree with you. It is more difficult.
But that, of course, opens up another issue, because if people do cross the line, they're then often surprised within the first 6 months at the extent to which the commercial environment is significantly more hostile than their previous environment in terms of notices, redundancies, what happens if you don't meet performance targets and so on. And that can be a big shock to people.
It can indeed, and it is one of the fundamental differences. The private sector, when it's going to get rid of people, is really very ruthless. It's quick, it's fast, it's sharp. And people need to understand that, because there isn't the same level of security that they get in the public sector. That's one of the risks that they take.
Yeah, okay. Now, this critical thing, what's the latest thinking about CVs? I mean, what would your advice be? You can buy books on it. You've probably prepared CVs in the past, or even maybe had them prepared for you in some circumstances. What would you say today about things like what's the purpose? What's the format? How long should they be? What kind of variations should you prepare? Let's look at CVs.
First thing to say is that they're crucial. They have a particular purpose, which I'll come on to, but they are crucial. People need to think about them very early. Again, I'll go back, even if it's 3 years out. Start thinking as early as you can. Start tabulating everything about yourself, whether that's your skill sets, your experiences, your achievements, and often forgotten and really, really important, your personal characteristics. And somehow the CV, in one form or another, and you mentioned people get help with their CVs sometimes, and you'll see various proponents that a CV should be chronological. Others will say that it should follow an achievement pattern. To be honest, I don't mind. What I do think matters is that the CV has got to embrace those 4 elements that I talked about, and very, very clearly, because that's what the future employer is looking for, and that they should also be embraced in the profile. Now, by the profile, I mean a box which follows the person's name and address, which has, without any verbs in it, just a quick summary of the most important factors that person believes represents them. So that in a one snapshot, a potential employer, even if he's going through, 100 CVs, is able to just look at that and say, yeah, that goes in the pile that we're going to go back to. And the others go in a pile that we're going to say thank you but no. So it is really crucial. What it is doing is it's probably the thing that is getting the interest of someone you want to take an interest in you. That may be someone in a network who are going to help you further on, or if it's the business you're applying to, you want them to look at it and say, we've got to look at this guy again. This guy seems to have what we want, or gal, of course, and absolutely crucial, absolutely crucial.
That prompts two further questions. One is that a lot of people simply list their postings or their credentials and either struggle because they don't know with, or resort to things like Myers-Briggs personality profiling, which only go so far. And of course the point is that we are often looking, especially in senior roles, for people demonstrating leadership qualities which we define separately, and they're often not in a CV. Would you like to comment on that aspect?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. They often miss out. They'll put something down which may be a shortened version of a job spec, but it's not actually saying what they've done, what their level of achievement has been, what the challenge has been. Those things have been missing, and that's very, very common that they're missing. You mentioned Myers-Briggs. There are uses for psychometric testing, which is what it is, and many companies have a psychometric testing process to try and identify the aptitude of an individual for a particular appointment, and often that's a psychometric test which is applicable across all functions. I mean, quite interestingly, and I think probably not enough people know this, is we of course have a profiling system which can help to identify those aspects which are required by aptitude to take up these senior appointments which demand leadership as well as just a basic technical skill set. Yeah.
Would you have a word on the situation where a number of our people come from backgrounds where their achievements are not publishable in a sense, and this creates challenges for people in human resource departments, or where people just can't translate how their command of a tank regiment translates into running a division with 300 people in it in a commercial enterprise?
Yeah. There are two separate parts to what you've described there. If I do those who are worried about giving information which may be covered, for example, by the Official Secrets Act or something like that, and that is a problem. And it is probably at its most problematic when they're thinking about what they're going to put in the CV, because the CV is going to hit a very wide audience. And I think there they usually try to use various forms of cover words. It is nonetheless possible to give enough interest to the reader by a careful choice of words, and we can always advise, and we do advise individuals on that. When it comes to going to an interview, facing that same challenge, then I think the important thing is that they have taken the trouble to talk to their employer inside the public sector to find out just what they can and cannot say. And for example, I know that with some of the leading agencies, intelligence and security agencies, they are, once they get into the interview, the person being interviewed is allowed to give more information over in that context. So they're not forced to handicap themselves all the way, and nor should they be. If we take the other part of what you mentioned, say the tank commander, the regimental commander in other respects, he's got to do this during his preparative period. Nobody will stop him saying what he's done. It's the fact is, and I think this is the point you were alluding to, the person listening may not understand. Exactly. So this is back to that language thing. They've got to be able to explain what they did in managerial and leadership terms which are going to be understood by the person who is interviewing them. And without that, they'll be seen as some sort of oddity. So they've got to get that right by themselves. Now, having said that, as you know, when we're helping our candidates, we go through that sort of thing as well.
Yeah, yeah. variations. I mean, people might be applying for several different jobs rather than one. Some people would say that's silly, you should focus on something, but other people are hedging their bets. It's possible you end up with a sea of variant CVs and a lot of confusion. What's your view on variations?
On variations? You mean variations in style of the CV?
Yeah.
My personal view is that it doesn't matter as long as it looks a well thought out CV. It can follow any particular flow, and I think I mentioned earlier, either chronologically or by achievements. It can do that. That profile box is critical, absolutely critical. But as long as everything is in there and it looks as though it's been produced with great care and purpose, then I think it's fine. You do hear people, and you know, you've come across them, who will say, a CV should be exactly like this or exactly like that. That's very worrying. It's very worrying because it's narrow thinking. Sometimes, and this started in America more so, various people started to put objectives in, usually below the profile, saying, my objective is, and they tailor their objective for the particular audience of that CV. I have no difficulty with that, no difficulty with it at all. And I don't think it's something, because it is beginning to creep in other parts of the world, it's certainly not a negative. Now, the other thing that sometimes happens is you see a photograph on a CV. My own personal view is it certainly wouldn't prejudice me. I'd be inclined to leave it off, but that's just a personal view.
Sure.
Maybe if I was Brad Pitt, I'd leave it on. But otherwise, I'd leave that off. But you do see it creeping in.
Okay. All right. Is it important to have relevant academic qualifications?
It's a thorny one, that. The younger you are, the more important it is that the person has academic qualifications. So if somebody's in their 20s and they're looking for a significant managerial post in the corporate security environment, then they will be expected to have a degree, a baccalaureate degree. If you move on with time, and we're seeing people then moving into their mid-30s and into their 40s and 45, it becomes less important. It doesn't mean to say it doesn't have a relevance, but what becomes much more important is what those individuals have achieved through a significant part of their working life. There are some companies who will state in the job requirement baccalaureate degree. But often now they're being wise enough to say baccalaureate degree or equivalent. I remember when we were doing an executive search program for an American multinational company, and they first of all told me what they wanted, and it said baccalaureate degree, and it wasn't baccalaureate degree or equivalent, it was just baccalaureate degree. And this was they were looking for a chief security officer. And I said to them, well, does that mean you don't want to see some of the best candidates? What do you mean, Dave? They said, what do you mean? I said, well, the fact is, in your society, the number of people who have baccalaureate degrees is huge. In some societies, it isn't. And yet there are people out there who are every bit as good as those with baccalaureate degrees, but they've got that experience and that intellectual challenge by different means. And of course, the answer came back, no, Dave, let's take a judgment on that. So if you think somebody has got what it takes and they don't have a baccalaureate degree, we want to hear. That's the general answer. Unfortunately, we've seen candidates who don't have baccalaureate degrees and they feel that it's a bit of a burden. It isn't. But it's got to be played right and explained right.
Okay. What's in your view, having been through this process yourself, what's the best way of becoming familiar with what we call the business world?
I'd go down two routes. First of all, broadly based journals, things like The Economist, Fortune 500. Read them. Read the things that business people read. on the narrow route, oh, and of course I mentioned earlier the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal and equivalents elsewhere. Read them, but don't stick to the bit that isn't the company section. You know, read the whole thing. But I think additionally to that, join some sort of association that produces a journal. And for example, I have in mind the American Society of Industrial Security International, as is international as is known. If you join that, which isn't very expensive, it puts out a journal every month which has articles on security within a commercial context. Pull all those together and that helps a great deal. A great deal. Now, if you're lucky enough and you're coming out of an organisation that before you come out is offering you some sort of training, then some of the universities, the business schools, do these 4-week introduction to business programs. Really worth doing. Really, really worth doing, and that helps. But it doesn't negate the value subsequently of reading all the journals that I've talked about, or the newspapers.
Okay. How do you start then? So you've got your, let's take the ideal scenario where you've got 3 years to go. How do you recommend people searching for jobs? I mean, in the military particularly, you don't have to do that in your entire career because you're given assignments from the day you enter to the day you leave. So somebody who's never had that, it must be extremely strange. How do they start looking for jobs?
Okay. And if I may, in answering it, I'm going to broaden my answer a little bit to embrace, I think, what you're looking for. First thing is they need to develop a network. And they could, incidentally, have been doing that throughout their careers, particularly if they're in an intelligence or security environment, law enforcement. They could have joined some of those associations I talked about earlier and started to build up a network of people. People who are already in the commercial world, people who they've known before in the public sector, who've moved into the commercial world. Network as much as you can to let people know what it is that you're setting out to do. Of course, the intensity of that needs to increase the closer you get to the point at which you're going to leave the service and go into your new jobs. So networking. Networks hear about jobs, and they've also got a huge wealth of advice to share with people. Now, the next thing, where do the jobs actually come from? They're often advertised. So start looking, even 3 years out, start looking at adverts. Quite frankly, even at the 3 years out point, I'd advise people to go for a few jobs because they might go for them, they might get an interview. So they're getting practice. And there's nothing better than getting practice at interviews for that sort of thing. So start looking intensely. Find out which papers and journals carry the jobs that relate to security and risk. Because there are certain ones that have more of those jobs in than others. Start thinking about recruitment agencies. What recruitment agencies are there out there that specialise in corporate security, like ours? But equally, what recruitment agencies are out there that perhaps look after major multinationals across all functions? So find out where you're going to put your name and register it at the point at which you really are nearly available. So do all that.
Well, on that point, they do all that. There's a balance, isn't there, surely, between not littering the world with your CV and choosing people that might best help you.
Yes, I think, of course there is. But I still believe in, if I was going to err in any direction, I think I'd err in littering the world rather than not getting it to all of the people who might be able to help you. And I think, in fairness, when I talk about the CV, if you've got a CV 3 years out, you're still probably using your network to refine your CV and to get other ideas and to talk to people about what jobs generically there are out there, as opposed to honing in on specific jobs. You can only hone in on specific jobs with one exception, which I'll talk about in a moment. You can only hone in on specific jobs when the job's been advertised or someone has told you this is vacant.
Yeah.
All right? The one exception to that is what is broadly covered by the term cold shots. And cold shots means that you're going out to organisations, either by email or letter, and I think that whether you choose email or letter probably depends on who you're targeting. If you're targeting someone on a main board, a chairman, a CEO, something like that, you're probably going to write a decent letter on Conqueror-type paper. Lower down, you're probably in the modern age going to get away with emails perfectly well. But these cold shots, where you're probably expressing, first of all, your wishes, you're probably enclosing a CV, you're explaining what you want to do in the future. You may be saying to them that you're looking for advice as opposed to specifically looking for a job, but you may include both. Why do I put that about advice? It's sometimes if you're asking people to help you, by telling them you're looking for a job and hoping they'll give you one, you're putting them in a corner.
Sure.
So it may be better not to put them in a corner, even if you'd quite like a job from them. Yeah. So, you say, look, I hope you can help me. Here's my CV. This is what I want to do with my life. I'd be very, very grateful for any advice. Of course, if any jobs are available, I'd be interested to know about that, but I'm really keen to get advice. When you're a little bit of time out, and you'd be amazed that, well, you may not be amazed, but quite a lot of people do help in those circumstances. Most, maybe not.
One last thing on this area, because obviously you are a dynamic individual and gregarious with it. There are a lot of people whose skills, IT-based and analytics-based, often have wonderful skills, but are significantly shyer, let's say, than you are. How do we help those people do this networking, chatting thing when it's not really in their nature and they often feel very much out of their comfort zone?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult. Of course, a lot of the networking is not person to person as we are now. A lot of that is by a written communication, which is not so bad. It's not so bad. They need help. And in that respect, and in respect of the interpersonal help, of course, we can give it to them. And personally, I give huge amount of help to people, whether there is a commercial value in it or not. Sure. And that has been something, I think you said at the beginning, that I've done for years. And you've put your finger on a very important point, because the interpersonal side, they've got to get practice in it. And somebody's got to be honest with them as well, that, you've got to relax. Let them know you've got to relax. You've got to sit easy. And of course, for a lot of people coming from the sort of backgrounds that we've talked about, the natural tendency is not to sit easy, not to relax. Practice helps. And that's one of the reasons I said earlier, it's worthwhile, and I would say almost more importantly, to the sort of people that you've just referred to, get some interviewing experience early on. Get it early on, perhaps by applying for the jobs. There are courses people can go on as well. But apply for the jobs, go through it, and then have a chat with people who can set you at ease. And even if something's gone wrong in a particular interview, then again, come to the likes of us and say, look, I'm worried about this. Certain things went wrong. This is how uncomfortable I felt about it. And we can help them through those problems. Can we make somebody, though, who is an absolute introvert into an interview-oriented expert? No.
Sure,
but what you can do is improve the situation.
Absolutely. Okay. If someone's come from a particularly specialist discipline, like an intelligence and security background, are they able to secure jobs from outside those skill sets?
The answer is yes, they are, and they have done. And I've known quite a number. But if we're talking about totality, it will be a minority. But it won't be a minority because they lack the ability. It will be a minority because most of the people from those backgrounds actually target employment in environments which are very similar. But all of those people who've been involved in intelligence and security and law enforcement, they have learned other managerial skills. If they hadn't had those other managerial skills, they would not have been able to carry out their jobs. So in one sense, it's a bit like you saying to me, would somebody coming out of a manufacturing company and having led that company or being in a senior managerial position, would they have the skill sets perhaps to go to a service supplying company? The answer is yes. They'll have lacked some experiences, but the skill sets are there, and that's no different from the public sector, where some of the skill sets really are very, very enviable.
Okay. Possibly a tricky area. In your experience, do potential employers have any prejudices, overt or covert, regarding candidates from the public sector?
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. It very much depends on the society of the person is in, the person who's looking for the jobs. In some societies, for example, the military are extremely well understood, particularly if there's conscription, for example, then almost every family is touched by the military. Of course, a lot of societies now don't have conscription, and they have military who are professional, and the numbers of the professional military are often reducing in the modern world, which means that fewer people in those societies are touched by the military. They see the police all the time, but law enforcement, but are they actually influenced personally by the police all the time? Maybe more so than the military, but not as much as though it was somebody else in a normal sort of non-public sector job that they mix with. So I think it is possible for, say, an army officer to go into an interview where the expectation of those doing the interview is that they're going to meet Colonel Blimp, a guy who will stand rigidly in front of them, might manage to sit down rigidly, and may come out with monosyllabic sentences. You know, that's the absurd side. It's almost the cartoon side. But they may have that impression. They may have the impression when a law enforcement officer comes along that that law enforcement officer is going to be what I think used to be called police constable plod.
Or that every secret intelligence service operator is James Bond.
Or is, absolutely. These stereotypical images do exist. However, you can play them to your advantage, because if the expectation is that somebody's going to come along and is going to be Colonel Blimp or PC Plod or James Bond, then you have a wonderful, wonderful opportunity as the person being interviewed to dislocate their expectations and come in and you are actually the exact opposite. You're relaxed, you're calm, my goodness, you're normal. And they'll like that. And they say, you know, they'll go away probably after the interview. You know, we met a guy from the military today. You'd be amazed. He really was normal.
Right. Okay. Should people expect to receive greater reward from the private sector? And the word reward applies to two areas. One is monetary compensation, and the other is personal goals, if you like.
Right. Let me take the personal goals first, okay? Greater reward in personal goals? Probably not, to be honest, in that the public sector, whichever part they went into, always have a wonderful career pyramid. Yes, they've chosen to come out of it for whatever reason, but from the beginning they had a marvellous career pyramid, which represents, in parallel terms, everything that you might expect in a commercial world as well. If they have left the public service because they have been frustrated in their careers, then of course they're getting a second bite. Now, in getting the second bite, depends on what age they've come out. They may have some limitations in that they may say, I want to strive for the very top, not just in my security environment. And they may be coming out and going into jobs where most of their peer group are in their 20s or early 30s. So that's quite difficult. Certainly reaching the top within their intelligence or security goals within a commercial sector, I think is very viable, depending on their talents. Now, let's come to this other side, which is the financial side. I think generally speaking, any individual will be paid more in the commercial sector than they will be in the public sector. Salaries are higher, or I should really say packages are higher. And one of the things that I advise people when we're talking about this is, you know, if you're comparing your previous salary with the salary you're going to get in the commercial world, then you've got to ask whoever's going to employ you, you've got to find out about the full package. The salary, the bonus potential, the share options, anything beneficial, the medical capability that they will have. Look at the totality and see how it fits. And I think almost without exception, it will be greater. It will be greater. But let us not forget the point that you made earlier. There is also less security of tenure, which is something which needs to have a balance on. And in one sense, it is fair to say that the commercial world, for their money, is probably going to want their pound of flesh almost for the amount of money they pay out. And if I think about my own experiences in the military, I would say that the intensity of work in the military was only similar to the commercial world when we were actually on operations. Right. So there is a price out there to pay for that reward. One thing I ought to touch upon is pensions, I suppose. The pensions will vary dramatically in the private sector. There's still a few pensions around that are final salary. Most companies are changing for those. And of course the individual will be expected to contribute to his pension. Now that happens in a lot of the public sector, but not in all public sectors. When we look around the world, there are many public sector employees who never have to pay for the pension, and then they get their pension after it.
One last word on packages. Of course, a lot of people have come from environments where, from beginning to end, they were within predetermined bands of compensation set by third parties, and they've never had the opportunity or been put in a position where they've had to negotiate for anything. Yeah. So suddenly, they've got this dream job. There's an HR director and a director probably with a remit to say we want that person but keep the cost down. What do they do to maximise their package?
You're absolutely right. And when I talk to people and help people, it's one of their main worries. It's not only how do I get the salary that I'm going to get, but how do I raise it? At what point should I talk about salary? And it is quite a challenge. Now, the first thing, of course, is when they're looking for jobs, by and large, some indication of the salary and package will probably have been given in the advertisement. Not always. Sometimes they don't now. But often there's an indication. So you've got some sort of ball mark for it. What I normally say to people is, first thing is, don't you raise salary. Let the company who you hope to work for raise the salary topic. Don't go in making it seem, or run the risk of making it seem, that your primary consideration is money. Okay? That may seem a bit quaint, because quite a lot of the people, and you know this, in the commercial world, the primary consideration of many is money. Yes, and that's a motivator. But I think for somebody from the public sector, there is also an expectation that they're not driven purely by the lure of money. So don't raise it. Let them raise it. They need to think, though, about what sort of money they should be looking for. And the advice I usually give to people who are coming out of the public sector is work out the amount of money per year that you require to continue your current life standard for you and your family. And they've got to think about things like schooling for children. If they're, for example, in the military, and the children are at independent schools, then a lot of that cost is being met by the public sector. It's not going to be met when they leave. So they need to take all their financial considerations and work out a line, I call it a line, below which they cannot afford to accept a salary. Now, I always also point out to them that line's probably going to be well below what they're going to get. But nevertheless, have that line so you understand it. I think as another aside, before I talk about the negotiation with the company, they need to understand this as well, that it is inappropriate for any future employing company to try and take into consideration their pension. I have known that done. It's wrong. It's no different to taking into consideration somebody's inherited wealth. You know, so that's not the answer. But then when they're looking at what they can get, there's different ways of doing it. If they have, you know, they need to say, well, what is, if they haven't been told, what is the salary and package for this? Always ask about the package. We touched upon that before, but always ask about the full package. What is it? Let them tell you. And they'll say usually between this and that. And if the lower part suits you fine, and it's a good increase, then you may say, well, comfortably, I don't really want to pursue it any further. You don't have to say, I'll take the lowest. Say to them, look, you're a big company, particularly if you're going for a big company. You're a big company, you've got your structures. Pay me what you'd pay anybody else of my ability and experience for any other function. And leave it to them. That's actually what I did. And subsequently, I discovered that they'd actually raised the figure. You talked about HR having a target figure, and they do. They'd raised that target figure by 2 increments. And I didn't even push it. So take that line. Another aspect, if I can bring it up in relation to salaries, sometimes people are going for a number of jobs. And they say to me, you know, should I go for the one with the biggest salary? And I say, not what I would do. I would go for the one that you feel you will enjoy most. And the one that you will enjoy most, you will probably do best in. And if you do best in it, the company that you go to is going to look after you anyway. And you can expect, in good times, salary increases which are far greater than your expectations were in the public sector. So if you're doing well.
So this comes back to a combination of what we're talking about at the beginning. It's a combination of the craft skills you can use to make a contribution, but also the more elusive qualities of leadership and expectation. So in terms of saying, well, David, should I hold out for the perfect job? The perfect job is a subjective definition, isn't it?
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. And the answer to it is no. Not unless you can see the perfect job that you think is perfect. If it's there and it's on the table and you're going for it, fine. Hold out for it. But in terms of, I don't know which job I'm going to get yet, and I'm just going for jobs, then don't hold out for it. Because if you hold out for it, you may hold out forever. You may never get the job. So be sensible. The other point about the perfect job, and you made the point, I think what you were referring to, there are some jobs out there, you don't know how good they are until you start to get to grips with them.
Till you've crossed the line, in fact.
That's right, until you've crossed the line. And some of them can be wonderful, absolutely wonderful jobs. So I think keep a broad outlook on that. If there's something that you prefer and it looks close to your idea of perfection and it's on the table, okay. If it isn't, keep your thoughts broad.
Okay. I think I probably know the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. Is rejection likely to be a problem?
For some people, yes. And that's very much personality driven. Optimists are less likely to be troubled by rejection. Because, let's be clear, and this is the reason you're asking a question, I'm sure, there will be rejections. A candidate be very, very lucky if they don't experience some rejection. And they might be very, very unlucky if they experience what seems an endless flow of rejection. The optimist is one much more likely by nature of their character to turn it round and say, okay, well, I'm now turning my attention to the next one. The people who tend to be on the pessimistic side really need to address this as part of their preparation and to address the fact that they are likely to be turned down. That's almost certain. It's going to happen. And they mustn't take it too personally. That, that this is, my God, nobody's going to take me on in the future because I've had 1 rejection, I've had 2 rejections. They're going to learn through the process of being rejected. They're going to refine probably how they work in an interview. They're probably going to refine some of the documentary supporting stuff with it, letters and CVs.
And there'll be things outside their control, like the operating culture of the organisation, the style of language they use.
Of course there will. And some people, you know, at the end of the day, and remember when I talked about what you have to try and describe in a CV, and I included personality, personal characteristics. Many companies have this thing that they might call our fit. You know, it might be, this is, I don't know, this is a Cadbury fit, this is a Kraft fit, you know, this is a GE fit. And they look beyond the other key professional aspects to something, and some poor soul may just not tie in with what they see as that particular fit. But they'll be somebody else's fit.
Yeah, exactly.
But they do have to inure themselves against rejection, because if they don't, it will start to drag them down.
Yeah.
And it will start to impede their performance.
Yeah. And we see that on personality tests, that if people have faced long-term rejection, they start to fall off on the dynamic elements of the personality profiling.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which, of course, is seen by the person reading it, but it is a problem.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So there might be a slight element of bias in the answer to my next question, but I have to ask it. What's your advice on the use of recruitment agencies?
Right. Recruitment agencies. Well, my first advice is that if someone is looking to get a job, then get your CV with as many recruitment agencies as you possibly can. Whether they have a good reputation or a bad reputation on the basis of what people have said to you, get your name into as many as you can. Why? Because we can't say, I mean, we have a recruitment agency, but we can't guarantee getting all the jobs.
Absolutely.
So you want to be, if you're someone looking for a job, you want to be ensuring that you've got your name with agencies that do have the job. So deal with it prophylactically.
Yeah.
I have different views on agencies, and if I can flow into some of those views, and it doesn't alter the fact, get your name with all of them. They're not all good at communicating, and that always appalls me, which is one of the things we do, because we dictated from the start that our communication with people will be without fault. There are good communicators out there, there are bad communicators out there.
And some agencies charge applicants for their services. What's your view on that?
There are some, it's a very small group, but there are some who will turn around and say to the candidate or someone who wants to go for certain jobs, look, we'll help you and we'll help you to get a job, but if we get a job for you, there's a fee. It happens. I'm sure that somewhere out there, somebody watching this at the moment may know of somebody who's got a job that way. My general view is don't do it. Don't waste your money. There's enough people out there, enough agencies out there prepared to help you without you paying out money. Okay. So don't pay it.
Okay, that's an interesting one. And also, of course, there are increasingly very worthwhile online job networking services, like LinkedIn for one, for instance.
Absolutely. You can get jobs through LinkedIn and other similar internet capabilities. Also, of course, a lot of the associations that I talked about right at the beginning will be vehicles for advertising jobs, because recruitment agencies and companies will go to them and say, look, can you put this advert out? By and large, they're paying nothing for it, and it's hitting a very relevant audience, very relevant audience. Perhaps there's one thing, if I may just jump in, because I was thinking about the communication and how important it is to have good communication with candidates. And it's just a personal thing that I loathe, is that increasingly, and this happens in the public sector, sadly, as well now, you find companies who will put out an advert, but it will be made clear that if somebody replies and wants the job, if they don't hear from them, then they haven't got it. You know, and that's the sort of thing which, and you and I agreed ages ago that we would never fall into that trap.
Yeah,
there must be, I think it's appalling, sometimes appalling.
Okay.
I've got that off my chest.
No, that's good. Right. Well, as an example of the way an interview should be a dialogue, I think this has been brilliant, and I've learnt a lot about you as a potential candidate, and you will have learnt some things that are interesting me as a recruiter. So let's ask you to try and close the circle on this one and say, let's give you a very short opportunity to say what are the principles that you believe form the foundation for a successful change of career.
Right. And as a principle should, these embrace everything that has come out in this interview. Yeah. The first principle is be prophylactic. Look at as many opportunities as you can. Explore as many outlooks as you can. If you've got a network, make it as wide as you can. If you're looking for jobs and you think there's a spectrum of areas in which you're interested, broaden it. So be prophylactic on everything and broaden everything. Take as wide a view as you possibly can, then you may encompass something that you may not have seen before. So prophylactic, broad approach to everything. The next thing is this is probably one of the most important things that an individual has ever embarked upon. So treat it as though it's the most important project that you've ever embarked on, and therefore drive it as in your previous career, I'm alluding now to the public sector career, you would have driven a major project, and think it out in the same way and take it from start to finish in that manner.
So be a project, or call yourself a project, or be a brand almost, and market it as such.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And what I've said embraces the principles, and that should touch. And so if we'd gone back over this interview and looked at all the elements that have come out, allow those principles to impact on those elements. Do that and it'll work. And the individuals will get the sort of job they want. Some may spend longer waiting and they may just be unlucky. I remember one guy who was coming out of the public sector and he was immensely suitable. Immensely suitable. And this is the worst case, incidentally, that I can ever remember. Immensely suitable. He'd done all the right things and it took him 18 months to get his actual job. He did some consultancy in between time. And he'd had 8 shortlisted interviews and just hadn't quite got them. And that was really unlucky. Fortunately, he fell into that category of optimist. Yes. He was inured against rejection, and he landed in the end a fabulous, fabulous job.
Right. Well, David, thank you. That to me represents a really good interview where I learnt lots of things about you. You learnt things about us. It was a useful dialogue, not a one-way process. And I'm sure we'll be inviting you back for further discussions with our colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin.
So that's what a good interview is about. That's what we at Burrill Green, that's www.burrillgreen.com, are all about. We're here to help you. We've combined all our services together in this virtuous circle I've mentioned before, including secure leadership, our search and selection enterprise, analysts for security, specialists for risk management and analytics, Crossing the Line, our book on the more details that we've explored in this interview, and our new learning centre, the Burrill Green Corporate Security Business School. Our mission is to help you to combine all our pragmatic experience and wisdom so that you don't have to go through many of the hurdles some of our own colleagues have had to do in the past. This is to enhance your chances of making a successful crossing of the line. We wish you every success and we're here to help, so please don't hesitate to get in touch, and thank you once again for listening. Goodbye.